So, hi, Chris. Thanks for talking to us.
Oh, hi.
First, I need to ask Chris Jagger, any relations to that other famous Jagger?
You know, I don't think I know what you're talking about. I've never heard that joke before. I guess you're talking about Mick Jagger, right?
Yeah.
Very funny. No, I'm no relation to Mick Jagger. Not that I'm aware of. Although I do play the guitar. I confess, I play the guitar.
Yeah. And we can Google your songs, right?
I'd rather you didn't.
Okay, we won't. So, like I said, nice to have you. I'm very excited to hear about your career and what you can offer for the students at the management course that I'm teaching. We're going over how it is to manage international or multicultural teams, and I thought to myself that you would be a fantastic candidate. Before we go into your career, do you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who is Chris Jagger?
Who is Chris Jagger? Well, that's difficult. Chris Jagger is a Brit. I was born in London, and I lived in London until I was 20 years old. I then started to live overseas, and since the age of 20, and I'll be 43 in January, I've spent I think next year I would have spent most of my life outside of the UK, which is a strange thing to come to terms with because I still think of myself as a Londoner. I suppose I'm not. In fact, I'm more of a Reykjavik guy now. I've lived in Iceland for 9 years, although during those 9 years, 2 years were spent in Africa, a year in Sweden, and probably a year in the UK, broken up over those 9 years. So, a Londoner by birth, not someone that ever had any aspiration for living overseas. It happened to me by accident. And I think probably most of my career is a product of circumstance rather than design.
The reason I wanted to talk to you is, well, you have a very interesting career. It has to be said. You have a very, fascinating for me, university lecturer. So could you maybe go over a little bit, just like a quick recap of what you've been doing since you were 17-year-old running around the streets of London?
Yeah, sure. As I said, I'm a product of opportunity and circumstance. I've done a few different things. Someone recently who was presenting me at a conference started with the introduction, Chris has a portfolio career. I wasn't sure what was meant by that until I listened to them explain. And I suppose it does sound unusual and diverse, but to me and perhaps people in my line of work, it isn't so unusual. But I started out with the Metropolitan Police, and my first job was answering emergency calls. At least this was my first full-time proper job. I had many small jobs before this. I then moved on to something that was known as the National Criminal Intelligence Service. It doesn't exist anymore. It's now called the National Crime Agency. I was then seconded, deployed overseas to the United Nations on behalf of the British government to work in Kosovo just after the war. And this was a really formative experience. I have very fond memories of that time, and over the years, I've kept that relationship alive with Kosovo, and I've actually worked there in a number of different capacities over the years. That job introduced me to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and I worked for NATO for 5.5 years in 3 different jobs. And I then met my Icelandic wife in Kosovo, and she was keen on coming home. I think she was homesick. And I decided to change career direction, and I left government service and formed my own company and moved here to Iceland. And the work that I ended up doing was very diverse. We had many different clients over the years, mostly in the field of education, training, security consultancy, management and leadership consultancy. And more recently, I've been in Africa for 2 years working for the European Commission as an advisor to a president on reforming the security sector. And currently, I'm working in Georgia, although partly remotely from Iceland, working on intelligence reform.
Okay, so let me get this straight. So 21-year-old, you're in Kosovo right after the war, doing field work there.
Yes.
You stay there for how many years?
It was nearly 2 years.
Nearly 2 years. So 23-year-old, you're at NATO.
I came back to London very briefly for just under a year. And then I got a job at NATO. Yeah, I was the youngest person that's ever been employed at NATO at this particular grade. It was quite a senior position. I was very, very proud of that. I was very lucky.
And you worked there for 5 years. So around 30-year-old, you decide on going into private business. You do consultancy work for what, 6 years? 5?
Yeah, it was for mostly for governments. Teaching at the Swedish Police Academy, Defense Academy, teaching at a university in Madrid, Rayon Carlos University, on a master's degree program. For the banks here in Iceland, for some other clients here in Iceland, but most of the work was overseas.
Yeah, and then 2 years ago, you ended up working for the
European Commission.
European Commission, yeah, the European.
Yeah. My old boss, who I still work with today occasionally, recently at a workshop, we were introducing each other rather than ourselves. And someone asked the question, wasn't Chris a bit young to be sent to Kosovo? And he said, well, he was causing me too much trouble in the office, so it was a good way of getting rid of him.
21, Kosovo.
Yes.
You're stuck in you're not stuck, you're there voluntarily. You're in a country that has just been ravaged by war. And you are part or somewhat leading a multinational team with many different cultures, I presume. How was that for a 21-year-old? Did you have the capacity to put yourself in other people's shoes at that time to understand the different cultures, the different drives between the people?
No, I didn't. And one of the things that I really learned from that particular experience was how difficult it can be when you've been indoctrinated into a particularly national way of approaching business. And when you're working in a multinational team, everybody's been indoctrinated into their own national way of doing business. That can create confusion, misunderstanding, conflict, and a great deal of challenges for creating an effective team. But I should explain that when I was sent to Kosovo, I was the head of a unit, but it was a very small unit. It was just 2 people, but with a senior responsibility. So whilst I wasn't in a leadership position at this age, I was leading a very sensitive and senior project. I was liaising directly with generals and senior people in the intelligence community, the chief of police. My job was to act as a liaison between the United Nations and NATO, and to create a community of people that could together share their resources to protect the security of the country, investigate organized crime, investigate terrorism. So I wasn't personally responsible for managing people at this particular stage, but I was in a position where I had to create teams. I had to help encourage the creation of teams and to support an environment where people from different backgrounds, different types of professional disciplines and from different countries could work together. And I think at that particular stage of my career, I probably thought the UK knew best and that the UK way was the right way. And I probably was quite frustrated when others didn't conform to that way of doing business. And it wasn't perhaps until I'd left Kosovo and had the opportunity to reflect, and certainly when I started at NATO, that I began to realize that a different mindset was needed.
Okay, so around 25, you start developing that mindset of approaching people from the culture that they are from and trying to understand where they are coming from with their agenda or with how they tackle the problem that is before them.
Yeah, I'd say so. So when I started at NATO, I was incredibly lucky. The job was a brand new position, working in Naples at the headquarters there that oversees the Balkans, the Mediterranean, and Iraq. And it was a 3-person team that I belonged to. And my boss was a retired senior British soldier who had spent most of his career working in multinational teams and creating and leading very elite teams, including UK Special Forces. And he was an incredible mentor, coach to me, to really guide me into this multinational environment. And there was a lot to learn. There was an awful lot to learn. But the role that I had at NATO was a senior advisory job. So we were advising the command group of NATO, which were generals and admirals and air marshals, on the impact of organized crime on military operations. But that command group itself was made up out of different nationalities. And of course, everyone at NATO represents different countries. And, so we're permanently surrounded in a multinational environment. The only thing that was common was the language, which was English. Otherwise, the ways in which the individuals around me thought about a problem, the way in which they conducted their analysis, their decision-making processes, all of the doctrine that they've been trained in was national and not multinational. And NATO has its own way of working, but generally, what actually happens in practice is these national systems coming together. So what you need are very good leaders that understand this and who are able to be sympathetic to different working practices, and embrace all of that and create a team that understands each other well and understands why there are different perspectives on how things can be done.
I have to ask, and now I'm thinking about the periods from 21 to 26, that period of your life. Do you remember any like surprise or some scene where you just thought about, in regards to the multicultural background of the people that you were working with? Do you remember anything that like sticks out that made you just throw away your papers and just want to leave the scene or something like that? Is there any story that you're allowed to tell us?
Well, yeah, I haven't. I'm going to have to think quickly here, because there are things that jump out to mind, but maybe they are a bit too sensitive. Well, what I would say very broadly on the answer to that is, I guess it relates back to this problem of being indoctrinated into a particular way of doing things that comes from your own organization or your own country. And in the environment in which I was working in, there's a very high level of professionalism. And the UK considers itself to be world leading in intelligence and investigations. And many countries look at the UK in that light. And I was effectively representing the UK, although I was working for the United Nations. And there's a certain discipline to how the UK believes certain types of intelligence should be collected, how that information should be handled. But the people that were actually responsible for collecting that information weren't from the UK. They were perhaps from another EU country or beyond. And my initial perception of some of their behavior was that it was extremely unprofessional, shocking, in fact. And that this would lead to all sorts of disasters and all sorts of risks. But actually it didn't. It didn't, because they knew exactly what they were doing. It's just that their practices were so different from mine that it was a very uncomfortable experience. You could only see the weaknesses, you couldn't see the strengths.
I think that is a very good point, that when we are in a different, when we arrive in a different culture, and I'm just thinking about myself when I moved to Sweden, which is not that far from Icelandic culture, but it is really, there's a lot of things that are, well, they're completely different than in Iceland, because in Iceland you want everything done yesterday. You want it done quickly, and we're called the ADHD nation for a reason, I think. And I hate it at first, how slowly everything, how every process, the process through to getting things done took such a long time. But now I kind of miss it. I got used to it, but I always thought, how can they run a system? How can they run a country with this much lag of service or commodity? Just getting a phone number took time. Yeah, so to me, that was like a bit of a culture shock. So I can imagine for you, the Brit raised in British ways, where things go in order, like a perfect Excel sheet, working with some other cultures that are a little bit less Excel-minded, maybe, or stuck in a box.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, in the example that I'm thinking of, the rules in which I had been indoctrinated to operate were all about ensuring that we're highly accountable, that we're very justified in the measures that we're taking, and from mistakes from the past, I suppose, lessons have been learned that have created the system that we were using now. But it was also very limiting. It meant that your hands were somehow tied in terms of your creativity. Whereas some of these other countries that perhaps didn't have as much experience in dealing with security, because the UK has had the unfortunate history of having a very intense history of threats. You know, there's always been terrorism and high levels of crime and many other things that have caused our security agencies to be permanently on a state of alert. Whereas many other countries have had the fortune of not living in those circumstances. So they haven't made as many mistakes. And their processes are not necessarily as developed. But the benefit of that can be that they have the ability to think more freely and they can operate more creatively. And then, of course, when you're working in a completely foreign environment, especially when you're helping a country develop its own practices, you know, one mustn't assume that their practices from their home country can be applied in this other country. You know, it needs to be bespoke. And you really need to understand the environment in which you're working and the culture and history and many other things in order to know which of the principles you take from that good practice and apply in this country. Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on. You're 26, you're working for NATO, you're moving up, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
You said you had 3 different roles within NATO. I don't know how the hierarchy is in NATO, but I'm guessing you moved up.
Yeah, I started as what they call an A3, which is the equivalent of a major in military terms. And I finished as an A5, which is colonel, and I believe I was the youngest A3 and A5 in NATO, which is you know, there you go. It's nothing to be proud of, I suppose. It's just a fascinating point.
It's good for the portfolio.
Yeah, so I had 3 jobs. The first one was organised crime advisor. The second job, which was the big jump, was director of the Kosovo Security Vetting Agency. And then I came back to NATO and headed up a maritime security forum, which was a sort of vision of my own creation, which was a very big multi-agency, multinational team that developed the first security assessment of the high seas of the Mediterranean.
Okay. And I'm guessing, especially in the Mediterranean, it's a very hard word for an Icelander. I'm guessing you met maybe some other challenges than you had in Kosovo in regards to multinationality and different cultures. I don't know what is true of it, but you've heard that around the Mediterranean, people are more relaxed. You know, I mean, it's hotter outside and you get more tired and all that. How was that for like someone that is used to the English rain to come to work with in that kind of a culture?
Well, I wouldn't say that was my experience because although, you know, I was working at the NATO headquarters based in southern Italy, which is in Naples. NATO itself, certainly the organisation, the part of it that I belonged to was pretty high performing and very disciplined. And the people that were seconded to NATO, irrelevant of the nation, there's a certain standard that they operate against. And I would say it was a pretty fast-moving and hard-working place. I think that the challenge in terms of you know, different cultures from different countries was less to do with internally within NATO in the context of the maritime project, and it was more to do with understanding the security environment that we were trying to observe. because there you've got many countries around the Mediterranean. I've lost count, but maybe it's, between 15 and 20 different countries, I think it is. And they all have different policies for dealing with security. And the differences in those policies create vulnerabilities where the Mediterranean can then be exploited. And creating some sort of cohesion in policy is very difficult. But NATO was trying to do that on a number of security problems. But of course, each country's got its own history, its own national politics, its own way of approaching security. And NATO's challenge there was to try and corral all of that and make the most out of it, and to make it as complementary and supportive as possible.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on from NATO. Let's you go and you take a couple of off years from the multicultural market and go into private sector where you did not say goodbye to the multicultural challenges at all, did you? I mean, your company, like you said, you worked in various locations. You went to where in Africa? Where you went? You had some projects in Africa, in Sweden.
Yeah. So I mean, so what happened was when we moved to Iceland, I took a short break from working and took a moment to reflect on what could I offer to help, and a project came along to develop a workshop on critical and creative thinking. In particular, this workshop was for the British government, for within the intelligence community. And one of the requirements for this workshop was actually to tackle this very challenge about understanding other people's cultures, understanding bias, understanding prejudice, and understanding how working in a multinational environment or working overseas can cause you to become misled and can create communication problems and can lead to your analysis failing. And so it was really about preventing what we would refer to in the security community as intelligence failure, but with a particular emphasis on understanding how to work in a multinational environment and overseas. So I developed this workshop on critical and creative thinking, which turned out to be quite successful. It's been trained or delivered in various different shapes and forms to well over 4,000 people now. It started out as a 2-day workshop and eventually turned into everything from 1 hour to 2 weeks. But the method that we use tends to be simulation exercises. And this is something that I've used very practically as well as training. We've used it to develop policy, to create teams, to create new agencies. Perhaps the best example of that is the work that we did in the Gambia.
Mm-hmm. And that's we'll head there. We'll head to Gambia later on.
Okay.
During that time, when you're in your private sector, when you're doing your private thing, after a couple of years of that, you start working for the European Commission. And what was your project there?
Well, this was actually the Gambia. So
yeah. There was nothing before that.
No, between NATO and Gambia, there were many different projects. We helped with the Breivik inquiry in Norway. Been teaching at the Swedish Police Academy, the Defence Academy, running anti-money laundering training at the banks here in Iceland. We did a bit of work for the European Commission, actually, on reviewing different strategies to deal with security across the Western Balkans. Lots of different educational projects. We developed some internet safety programs in Sweden and also here in Iceland for children. I wrote a book. There have been many different things during that particular period.
Yeah. Okay. Let's then move forward towards your most recent posting, European Commission, working in Gambia. That's actually around that time that I met you. We were thinking about hosting it here at the University of Akureyri, some parts of it.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought you were like a internet scam or something. I didn't believe that some guy named Chris Jagger was trying to contact me to get some Gambians to host a conference here at the University of Akureyri. I had to go through channels to find out if this was correct.
And then you thought I was a failed rock and roll star.
Yeah, that too. When I Googled Chris Jagger, I found out that's the younger brother of Mick Jagger. So imagine my surprise when I learned that you were not him.
It's not the first time that's happened.
No, I can imagine. I don't have anyone famous that's named as me, so I don't know how that.
Well, you're pretty famous, aren't you? Handball then.
Yeah, no, not famous for that. Well, I haven't found my stardom. It will come. It'll be there. Maybe this podcast.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah, maybe.
Probably not this interview, but
we don't know. Okay, but you work for the European Commission. You get an assignment of reforming the. Well, it's best you say it. I'll probably say it wrong. What was your posting?
Okay, well, this is a very special project to me. I have a great deal of fondness and now nostalgia for Gambia. It was a great privilege to take on this particular role. And for me, from a professional point of view, it was the sort of challenge that I've always looked for in my career. And one that in my own world, I would have hoped that I was capable of doing, but, always wondered whether or not I was up to the challenge. So it came at a very good time. I've been running my own company for some years, but these were all short-term engagements. And whilst it was a lot of fun and I learned a lot and it was wonderful working with such a diverse range of clients, I really felt the need to take on a longer term responsibility. And also I missed owning, managing, creating projects and teams. And this was going to let me do all of these things. So initially I was invited out to the Gambia just for 1 month as an advisor to the president on the creation of a new government agency in a particular field of security that I happen to have some speciality in. But during that month, I think I probably fell in love with Gambia. And to my luck, a job came up as an advisor to the presidency on reforming the security sector. So I applied for the job, was interviewed and got the job. So I deployed to Gambia on a full-time basis. And this was a blank template job. The mandate was huge. The security sector covers all of the government agencies that deal with everything from policing, immigration, customs, coast guard, navy, army, everything. And there were other agencies working there, United Nations. There were other EU projects as well. ECOWAS, which is a West African alliance, economic and military alliance. They were working there. And a number of other agencies and also bilateral support. So the US government, the UK government, Turkish, there were many different players who were supporting the reform of the security sector. Now, why? Why were we there? Maybe you're the one supposed to be asking the questions, but I think that's an important question to answer. Gambia had gone through 22 years of a military dictatorship. And in 2016, the dictatorship fell and the first democratically appointed government was put into place. And with that, the Gambia rejoined the International Criminal Court, rejoined the Commonwealth, and the European Union significantly increased its support to helping the Gambia become a fully fledged democracy. And part of that was to reform the security sector because the dictator had used the security sector, he had exploited it as a tool of oppression and also a tool to keep himself in power. So the job that was given to me was to, first of all, do an analysis of where we stood to make recommendations on what the priorities should be for the reforms, and then to create and then lead a team, and to hand over that team to the Gambian government, once having created the momentum to continue with those reforms. So it was a project that spanned over 2 years, and it really was an incredible experience.
That I can, like you said before, this was a challenge that you've been waiting for, and knowing you, I can imagine this was the challenge you were waiting for, because this is really challenging. I mean, you're coming into a country that's coming out of a 22-year-old dictatorship, where the police has been used, well, not the security sector has been used as a tool of oppression, well, like most dictators do. So there has to be like a lot of hurt and anger within the society. And then to top it all, you have like a completely different culture that you're working in. So this has got to be very challenging for you to create trust, to create well, how you say, like something that you can work upon from, somewhat of a platform for you to do your work in a completely torn society with a different culture, with a completely different culture that you know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when I took on the job, there were a number of I suppose warning flags that I had in my own mind that I knew that I needed to tackle in order to make sure that I was going to understand the place where I was about to work. So I'll give you a concrete example. When I went to Kosovo all those years before, I was given a briefing on my way from the airport to the NATO base in the back of an armoured Humvee in a military escort about the security status in the country. And I was told by the soldier, who was my protection officer, that anyone outside of the barbed wire fence is the enemy, that you're in the home of organised crime. This is the crossroads of organised crime in Europe. And, you know, that was my introduction. It felt like a dangerous place. It looked like a dangerous place. Once I eventually arrived on the camp, we went through a series of indoctrination briefings, all of which were very heavy, very serious, all of which focused on the threats, and it framed your thinking. And it caused you to develop what you might refer to as a prevailing wisdom about the country. And that then caused you to see everything in that light. So any new information that came in, you read it into that context. You know, you might call that confirmation bias. And having worked in so many countries, and with so many different cultures, I knew that going to somewhere like Gambia, that's so far away from, you know, the cultures that I've worked in, that's gone through such a difficult history that I can't possibly understand quickly, that I needed to be as open-minded as possible. And I needed to be very cautious that I didn't make assumptions. And also that I wouldn't be influenced by many of the senior internationals around me who may not be as open-minded as I am. You know, you go into that sort of environment and you want to try and conduct an analysis quickly and to understand the place in which you're working. You know, you want to learn about the culture, the history, and there's many assumptions that come from that. And very often the easiest place to learn is by talking to your peers. But in a small community like the Gambia, it's a relatively small international community. I knew that there would be a kind of dialogue that existed within the international community that could help or cause you to become framed in your thinking, and that might be unhelpful. So the approach that I took was to listen to everybody and try as hard as possible not to draw any conclusions. So I created a list of questions that I thought would help me understand the country. And I traveled as widely as possible, and I met with as many different people as possible from all walks of life, and asked the same questions and just listened. And I tried not to have an opinion. And people wanted me to have an opinion. You know, I was in a senior job and they wanted to know how I was going to help. and what my plan was going to be. But I knew that I needed to resist that temptation and to give myself the time in order to do this analysis and to think as objectively as possible. And it did take time. And actually, I found that some of the most useful people that I spoke to were the least obvious. They weren't people that were senior government officials working on security. It wasn't people in the international community. But it was my taxi driver or the guy that made green tea sat on the corner that was obsessive listening to the radio all day, every day, and was very good with tourists. And he was used to Westerners and, how Westerners think. And talking to people like that helped me make the bridge between perhaps how I see the problem in terms of how I've been indoctrinated and how Gambia thinks and behaves. So, I gave myself a couple of months to listen more than speaking and to reflect before I started to develop my own plan. And then the next step really was to create a team that could teach me. I was coaching them and I was teaching them good practice. But in order to know how to teach them and where the emphasis needed to be, in terms of implementing good practice, they also needed to teach me about the realities in Gambia, what could and couldn't be achieved, what would work in a Gambian context. So it was a two-way process. As I formed this team and turned them into a team and raised their skills and their knowledge, they were also training me and teaching me about their country. And over a period of time, I think together, we became pretty good at helping each other.
Okay. There's one thing you mentioned that, of course, this takes a lot of time, and this is in fact this harmonizes with my favorite saying, which is assumption is the mother of all fuck ups. Excuse me for the language, but what you do is that you go into the country, you talk to locals, the locals that cannot. You don't want people to tell you how the people in Gambia are. You want to experience it yourself. And what you mentioned, the confirmation bias that we're trained to do. We have this doctrine of understanding other cultures through stereotypes. And by seeing people act according to these stereotypes, we're using the confirmation bias. We're seeing, oh, this is just like I've heard those people are. You get what I'm saying? That we do use the confirmation bias to confirm what we've been taught.
Yeah.
So what you did was that you went the exact opposite way. You went in with a blank slate and decided on not making any assumptions before landing in.
And also to try and identify my own assumptions, and to identify my own biases, if you like, and also theirs, So very often to understand someone else's culture, the first step is to understand how your own culture causes you to misread them. So self-awareness is critical, and understanding the lens in which you see the world. And that lens has been created by many different things: your education, your professional experience, your religious beliefs. There's a whole host of things that create that lens. But the reality is, it is a lens. It isn't a clear thing. You're looking through something that causes you to see it differently from perhaps how it is. So that the first thing is to try as best as you can to understand your own filter. And then it becomes easier to understand what you're seeing and hearing and witnessing. And that really affects how you create a team, how you manage a team, and how you lead a team. I mean, I'll be the first to admit that I wasn't very good at leading. Well, I won't say leading, managing the team is probably more accurate in my first months. There was a whole host of management principles that I was bringing to the team. Traditional things, setting deadlines, setting tasks, allocating work, so on and so forth. And they weren't conforming to my practices. But what I discovered was that by setting a vision and creating the conditions for the team to succeed, by raising their skills, by giving them the tools and then leaving them alone, they became incredibly effective. But their management principles, the way in which they went about doing their work, is so different from how I would do it and from how we did it at NATO or the UN or in the British government. Very difficult for me. And they taught me so much as a consequence of this. So probably the best thing that I did was to get out of the way a little bit.
Okay. But you raise an interesting point. You're creating, there you have, well, not a multicultural, multinational team, but you have a team completely different from your culture, from what you've, from your lenses, so to say. Wouldn't that be like, well, if I would ask you to tell the students or the people that listen to this, what is the key factors in creating a successful team within an international environment or multicultural environment? Wouldn't that harmonize a little bit with what you just said there, that you are self-aware, you are aware of your biases, you're aware of your lenses, you know that you experience things maybe a little bit differently than the people that you're working with?
Yeah. I think, I'm someone that tends to be suspicious of simplistic formulas to things. But there probably are a series of steps that I would go through now, which I've learned from experience, that would help me reach the point where I would feel confident that I can form a very effective, high-performing team. And, if I was in this position again, certainly self-awareness is key. But, we're never going to be perfect at any of these things. You'll always have some biases that you won't discover. There will always be miscommunication, misunderstanding when you're dealing with different cultures. The important thing there is that everyone respects that and that it doesn't turn into a disagreement, but that in a multinational team, you create the conditions and an atmosphere where everyone's respectful of differences and they're thoughtful and they're empathetic towards differences, and that they work to try and understand them and appreciate why things are different and where the benefits could be in appreciating those differences. I'm not saying that you can, formulaically create a team that will avoid those sorts of problems. So a willingness to observe, to understand, being sympathetic to different cultures and different ways of doing things. And then it's really, in my experience in the Gambia, it was about creating an environment and a vision for the team to succeed. I initially recruited 8 people, trained them very well, developed plans that they owned and they understood. And then over the 2 years, that team turned into 150 people from right across society. And I left the Gambians to recruit their own people. I was leading the project, but they found the rest of their team members, and they were responsible for coaching and indoctrinating the others. And I stand back from it. My job was to ensure that they were protected and that they were supported to succeed, but not to manage. They managed the project themselves.
Okay. There's one thing that I thought of just now, that when you're managing a team within your country just like if you had a team of Brits, let's go with that. I think the same principles apply actually to a local team as in with the international team and multicultural team, in the self-awareness, and that people come from different backgrounds. People have like different views of the world or the projects and all that. So maybe it's not that different working in a international, multicultural environment if you are aware that your presumptions, your lenses, if I may, are different from others.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think, the benefit of a multinational team is also the challenge. The multinationalism brings the opportunity of different perspectives, and the different perspectives create an enhanced chance of you seeing more risks and seeing more opportunities. But not if you don't run that team well, and if you're not self-aware, and if you don't have the openness and the willingness to understand each other. And so there are many advantages to working in a multinational team. Those different perspectives can really help create a highly effective team. But equally, not necessarily. If you've got someone if the boss is especially dominating and insists that the UK way, for example, is the correct way of doing things, then you frustrate those different perspectives. People will then try to conform to an indoctrinated policy that they don't really understand. So, you have to allow for differences in opinion. You have to allow for what you might call the devil's advocate, I suppose. You have to allow for people to make mistakes and to put forward ideas that don't necessarily fit straight away. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what we did in the Gambia and what I've done elsewhere is I generally have two things running at the same time. So I have a project team that's implementing something tangible and real. So in the case of the Gambia, we were developing the country's first counterterrorism strategy. But running alongside that, the same team would be involved in simulations and workshops where there's total freedom to explore all sorts of ideas, many different perspectives. And we would examine loads of different ways of doing things that we wouldn't necessarily use in the project's implementation team. So it was a safe space for us to explore, to think, to debate, to challenge each other. And we used lots of different techniques for doing that. We ran these simulation exercises. We had lots of analytical projects that looked at different tools and techniques for encouraging different perspectives. And that vehicle made us much stronger when we then stepped across back into the implementation project.
Yeah. And these, now I'm thinking about just management in general, moving away from the multinational, multicultural. I mean, these ways to do things, you can apply them locally as you can, as everywhere. These are just good management points. But unfortunately, we cannot. I would like to speak to you. Well, I could spend the rest of the day speaking to you about management, as we have done once before. I'm afraid that people will tune out very soon if we don't wrap this up.
Well, that's your fault.
Yeah, I know. But Chris, thank you so much for giving us your time. It's been a real pleasure. It's been very interesting to hear about your career and about everything you've done. And hopefully we'll hear more from you in the future.
Oh, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. This is a really interesting subject and one that is very much on my mind at the moment. I'm actually beginning to write a book called The Utility of Thought. And, a major part of that book will be about operating in different cultures and what that means in terms of teamwork and leadership. So it's a subject that's very much on my mind at the moment. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
You're welcome. And apparently free advertisement for your book. Did not know that was part of the program, but let's go with it. Okay, but thank you, Chris, and have a fantastic day.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bye.